Today is the 7th of December. It is Pearl Harbor Day for those people who do not realize. It's 79 years ago today. The Japanese made a so-called surprise attack at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Why do I bring this up? Well, I think people need to understand a few things about Pearl Harbor that they weren't really taught. People wonder why the Japanese attacked America on this day 79 years ago. Well, I'm going to tell you why they did this. Back in that time, the Japanese were on an imperialistic conquest of the Far East. They had imperial ideas and dreams and aspirations. And they wanted to basically rule over as much territory in the Far East as they could. Now, Japan is a little tiny island. Get a map, take a look. They have limited resources. The interesting thing about the Japanese is they were always really good imitative people. And unlike other cultures in the Far East, they were quick to adopt Western culture, or adopt some of it. So they were westernized and relatively quickly, in a sense. Once they were exposed to Europeans, they liked a lot of the things the Europeans had. The steamboats, they industrialized rather quickly. They kept their own culture, but they really, they adapted really. What they took everything they liked from Western civilization and made it their own. So when they were on a quest back in that time, they were on a quest not only to rule, but they were looking for resources. And when you wage a war, you need resources. You have to have resources. So what happened is the United States put an oil embargo upon them, so they couldn't get any oil anywhere. And all of a sudden now their war efforts were kind of halted. Now, mind you, they formed a pact with Germany and Italy at the time. They called themselves the Axis powers. And they weren't at war with the United States, but they felt that they were pushed into a corner because of the oil embargo. And what they did is they made this decision to bomb Pearl Harbor because they expected, and their intelligence was wrong, they expected the entire United States fleet to be in port for Christmas. And their intel was wrong, and they expected the majority of the aircraft carriers and battleships and everything were going to be in Pearl Harbor. So they decided to take a offensive strike and take the United States out of commission by getting rid of its Navy. Now, you have to remember, at the time, you're on the other side of the Pacific. With the United States with no Navy, you have free reign. No one's going to mess with you. No one's going to cause you any problems. So the Japanese decided they were going to take this. It was a strategic strike. They thought they would knock us out of commission. Not having an army, not having a navy, it would take forever for us to rebuild it. And by the time they got their stuff together, they'll be all set. That's why they bombed Pearl Harbor. But they made a mistake. Their intel was wrong, and there was a big battle fleet, and I can't remember exactly where, but it was out on a training mission. It wasn't docked in Pearl Harbor like they thought it was, and that escaped the damage. They thought that they had won, and what it really did, and one of their generals said this, that he was afraid they have woken a sleeping giant. You have to remember something. At that particular time, we were in the middle of a depression that Roosevelt still was not able to bring us out of through his little socialistic endeavors. he was not able to bring the United States out of the Great Depression. The whole world was at it. Germany was pretty much out of it because they started a war machine. They already pretty much went through Europe, the Germans, and conquered just about every place. And they were working at the moment on Great Britain. Well, and this is where it gets funny. See, FDR was trying to get the United States involved in the war in Europe for a long time, but the anti-war sentiment of the United States population was extremely high. Nobody wanted to go to war in Europe again because it's only 20 years after World War I. Everybody was disappointed about how World War I ended. It was supposed to be the war that ended all wars. It was catastrophic because the Depression followed not long after. It ruined Europe, destroyed Europe, and it killed a lot of Americans, and they all felt that it was all for nothing. Nobody wanted to go to war. They said this: let Hitler let Europe worry about its own problems. We're not getting involved in any more foreign wars in Europe. We're done. And according to our Constitution, Congress has the right to declare war. So the story is, there is a lot of thought that when the Japanese were on their way to bomb Pearl Harbor, that FDR got the intel that there was a Japanese squadron heading that way. And FDR more or less knew what was happening and decided to just let it happen because he knew that act of bombing soldiers who were on holiday leave early Sunday morning while they were still in their pajamas getting ready for church, they knew that would create an anger amongst the American population that would drive us into World War II. And sure enough, that is exactly what it did. It's exactly what it did. Everybody was incensed because we never really went to war with the Japanese. We just were trying to starve them out, more or less, with our embargoes. And so what happens is the American people are pissed off. I mean, I got my uncle's draft papers at home, and he was drafted, within a week. I mean, they didn't waste any time with draft papers. FDR gave his famous, the day that will live in infamy speech before Congress, and Congress declares war. Then the Japanese declare war. 2 days after that, Hitler declares war. And that's what FDR wanted. See, FDR wanted this because he knew that if Britain fell to the Nazis, and mind you, Hitler is bombing England every single day, every night, I should say. The bomb raids are coming. He is wiping them out. And he knew that if Britain fell, Europe was lost. You will never get your foot in Europe again because the Nazis would be too strong and powerful if Britain fell, because they owned half of the world. They had the British Empire. The old story was the sun never set on the British Empire, and it never did because the sun was always shining somewhere on the lands that they owned or claimed. And to have all those resources pouring into Nazi Germany, their war machine would have been just damn near impossible to get rid of. So, what's the first thing that happens? Well, FDR sends everything he could to Britain to save Britain, long before we started to deal with the Japanese. Long before the Japanese, it bought the Japanese some time. Pearl Harbor bought the Japanese some time to get more and more entrenched over in the Pacific Theater. But we went into Europe really quick because they were worried about Britain. Now, this is considered a conspiracy theory, but if you think about it, it makes a lot more sense. I know my uncle always believed that FDR let it happen because the anti-war sentiment was so high. Nobody cared what happened in Europe. Nobody cared what happened in Japan. Let them do what they got to do. Just leave us alone. It was an isolationist type thing. I can't tell you how many people died that day. I know our Navy was crippled for a short period of time. But what it did do is it started up the American war machine. And we have a big country, and part of being a big country is we have all the resources we need to make anything we need, from missiles to tanks to ships. We don't have to get any of that stuff from outside sources like Japan had to do. And once the war machine started up, it put people back to work. It ended the Depression. The Depression ended because we went into World War II. Not because FDR was some kind of brilliant socialist bringing socialist programs to put America back to work again. It has nothing to do with that. It had to do with starting up an American war machine. And what it really came down to, once the war was all over, we were the only standing world power with incredible economic might compared to the rest of the world. We devastated Germany, and all of Europe was pretty much turned into rubble. We had to rebuild that through the Marshall Plan. And then because of the way we signed treaties and this and that, they weren't ever allowed to have armies again. So the Germans weren't allowed to have armies, Japanese weren't allowed to have armies, and we were economically controlling the world at the end of World War II. One can argue this: the Soviet Union was communist. They could never create a good product, because you can't create good products under communism. It doesn't exist. If people are motivated by capitalism and producing a good product that people will buy, if everybody's working for the state making shoes, you don't give a damn about what the quality of the shoe is. If that makes any sense. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, people are woefully ignorant about history, woefully ignorant about the past, woefully ignorant about the motives and the reasons that these things are sometimes done. Now, having said that, FDR is often looked at as a hero by liberals. I know Barack Obama thought he would take a page from the FDR book when he had his little thing to try to build the economy back when he took power back in 2008, 2006, whatever the heck that was. All he did was build sidewalks running along cornfields. It didn't do anything. Because the truth is, FDR's economic policies weren't doing a damn thing. Because you needed something to kickstart an economy, and war can kickstart an economy. What else came out of this? Well, FDR decided to have internment camps for Japanese Americans. Now notice he didn't have internment camps for Italian Americans or German Americans, who we were at war with too, but specifically Japanese Americans. And I know somebody personally whose grandparents were totally wiped. They were Japanese, wiped out in California by the internment policy. They lost their businesses. They had to close up their shops and their businesses and voluntarily walk into giant, more or less a concentration camp, where they held them as being threats to national security. These were Japanese American citizens. They weren't illegals. They weren't here legally. They were naturalized Japanese citizens, and predominantly most of them were on the West Coast. And it's a sad chapter in our history, but FDR did that. Is there racism in the past in the United States of America? Absolutely there is. People by nature are racist. I hate to tell you this, folks. People are racist and prejudiced and bigoted. It's part of the human condition. And when you add fear to it, when you throw fear into something like this, particularly in wartime, that makes matters worse. It makes matters much worse. So, having said that, FDR was not an angel. He wasn't. Modern liberals like to look at him as like their savior. He wasn't an angel. They don't like to talk about the Japanese internment camp, and they definitely don't want to ever mention about what he allowed to happen with Pearl Harbor. Now, it's not considered 100% fact of what he let happen to Pearl Harbor, but the odds are it's something that you have to look at. It's something that has to be looked at. Because we were never going to war with Hitler if it wasn't for the Japanese. Remember that.